Alright guys, so these are the main components for Outpost Siberia. And I'm going to give you a quick run through on the rules here, but first let me point something out. So this right here, this is the rule book for Outpost Siberia. And while this will let you play the game, this will give you everything that you really need, I have to definitely stress for you to go and download the survival guide. You can get it, I believe, from the IDW website, but even easier, it's available on Board Game Geek under the Outpost Siberia game. And what that is that's an updated PDF with some additional information, some slight rules tweaks that actually makes the game a little bit easier. And you're still going to lose a lot because it's the type of game that this is, but it does change some things that makes the game a little less frustrating in the wrong ways. It's the perfect changes that definitely help tweak the gameplay just right. So again, it's called the Survival Guide. Go check that out. Okay, so first and foremost, this is for 2 to 6 players. I really don't see a reason why you couldn't play this solo. I think it would function just fine. It's a lot more fun when you're going through the stress with another person. But again, I've played this on my own during the lunch hour or whatever. When I just have some downtime, and it definitely works. It's definitely enjoyable that way, but it's a lot of fun when you're interacting and suffering with somebody else. So can be a solo game. It says 2 to 6, but I think you could play it with 1. Let me start by going through these cards real quick. These are multi-purpose cards, and what that means is if you see here, this card up here has one item, and if you flip it over, it has another item. Now, what that basically means is depending where you draw this card from, or any of these cards from really, they could either be an event, bad stuff that happens, or it becomes an item card. So a lot of these items as you play them, or a lot of these events I should say, as you play them and as you go through the threats, once you defeat them or make your way through them, they'll make their way to the discard pile, and then they'll come back in as their as an item. So you'll be able to kind of eventually put those items to use, and you don't have to worry about the threats any longer. All right, so when you do the initial setup, you're going to put your cards into 4 piles. You're going to have your survivors, and these are the characters that you play throughout the game. You're going to have your bad events, and these are obviously, as it says, these are bad things that happen. Then you're going to have your good events. Now these are considered to be good, but there's still some bad involved with the good event, and we'll get to that as we explain this game. And then you have your threats, and these are the really bad creatures or things that happen as the game goes on. Now, when you do the initial setup, one of the updated rules in the survival guide is that you're going to randomly remove 6 of these threat cards. And these threat cards could be just different things you may encounter, and each one's going to have a different action, something that they do that's bad, in addition to how much life they have and how much damage they do when they arrive. So we're going to shuffle these, and you can just randomly remove 6 during your gameplay. So I'll just do that for the sake of this little setup. Then you're left with the threats you're going to use in the game. And then you're going to go ahead and take these, and this is another updated rule, of the threats that are discarded. You're discarding 6 of them. You're going to deal one of those to each person who's playing in the game, and this will make up their starting hand. So you'll see it'll start you off with an attack value and a food. Or I shouldn't say food, but food or water or what have you. And any players, so if you're only playing with 3 players, those extra 3 cards just get sent back to the box so you don't use them during the game. Then what you're going to do is you're going to choose a character. You can just go through here. If you notice, each character has obviously a name, and then they have a little action that they can perform. Each one's different. And then they have life. One thing that I would suggest is there are these 2 here, the Trail Guide and the Ice Climber, that they're kind of low on the life scale. So if this is your first game and there's not 6 of you, you might want to shy away from using these 2, although their actions are pretty helpful. But when you're getting started with the game, it's good to kind of go at it with a full 4 life points. Just my recommendation anyway. Once you have your first play and you're familiar with the game, hey, go at it any way you want. So then what you're going to do is you're going to shuffle the event decks, and you're going to choose your difficulty level. So what that means is if you're playing easy, you're going to pick 8 good events and 4 bad events. If you're going normal, you're going to do 6 and 6. And then if you're going hard, you'll do 4 good events and 6 bad events. And of course, you can customize this any way you want. You just want to have a total of 12 events. So if, let's say you're going to do just a normal game, you could take 6 cards out, set the rest aside, 6 cards of these and set these aside as well. And then what you're going to do with this, with the good and bad events that you decide to keep, you're going to take those in with the threat deck and you're going to shuffle it up really good. And this here is going to make up your expedition deck. And this is the deck that when you play the game, you need to make it all the way through this deck and clear every threat and every event that comes through in order to win the game. So you'll shuffle this up really well, better than I do in this little example here, but you get the idea. And then the remaining cards, the cards that you don't use, these become your Outpost deck. And that means these are just used as the items that they are. So first aid kits, ice axes, water, food, what have you. And this is what your characters will draw each turn. So one way to kind of help you, if you notice this is yellow here, you flip so the yellow side is face up. The way that I really remember is you're on a cold mountain, the bad stuff is blue because you're cold, you're freezing. So I always keep that face up and it kind of helps me. That's how I remember anyway, but then again, each their own. So now one thing to add about the character cards, before I forget, is your life points are your max life that you can have throughout the game. So if you play a card that say this guy's at 4 health already, and you play a card that lets him gain a health point, you can't actually go beyond 4. So there is a max out. You can't go above your default health. So that's important to note as the game goes on. All right, in order to win this game, all survivors must survive and clear all cards from the expedition deck. If you manage to clear all cards but you lose one person, if one person dies, you lose the game. So it's really all for one, one for all. There's no player elimination. It's you either are all going to make it through this or you're going to die together. And this game is played in rounds. Each player will get 1 turn per round, and then after each player has a turn, they draw a threat card out of the expedition deck. And when you're choosing player turn order, it's up to you to pick what order you guys want to go in. There might be some benefits to having, like if this is the start of a round, you might want Expedition Lead Hans to go first because of his special ability, or maybe he's more injured, and that way when a threat attacks, it's going to attack somebody who's not currently playing or who's not currently taking the action. So if you have an injured person, you might want to have them play first. So again, you pick as a group who wants to go first. And then in order to do the second player, you again get to pick who goes next, unless if there is a threat drawn, not a bad event, but if a threat's drawn, it actually does this damage to one player in your party. And what happens is whoever takes that damage, and I'll explain how that happens in a bit, but whoever takes that damage would be forced to take the next turn. And each turn is made up of 5 phases. And starting with the first phase, you're going to draw Outpost cards. Now, this is one of the updated rules in the survival guide. And in that, you're going to draw, with the updated rules, you're going to draw 3 cards. And look at them. You discard 1 card. So say whatever, you don't want this card. And then 1 card is going to go in your hand, and the other card is going to be played into your supply. And what that means by the supply is if it's in your hand, okay, you can only use it for its attack value, or its combat value as it's called in this game. If it goes to the supply, it's used as the item that it is. So, for example, in my hand, I can't use this as a flamethrower to defeat a threat. I actually can only use it to do damage to a threat. However, if this was in the supply, I would be able to use this to defeat a threat. And again, that'll make sense as I do a gameplay example, but just remember that if it's in your hand, use it for the combat value. If it's in your supply, you use it for the item that it is. The second phase in a turn is to attack threats. So let's bring up a threat here. So let's say this is currently an active threat. So you may choose to attack a threat. So say this is my hand. I can play an attack card or any number of cards from my hand to do damage to this threat. So right here, it would be perfect. I could play this card on this, and that would do 2 damage to this raging onager. Now, you have to note that even though this does damage, this card is not removed, and that's important, and that'll make sense at the next step here. So once you play any number of cards, you get to use equipment, and that would be whatever is in the supply deck. So in this example, let's say this was in our supply deck. We could use the flamethrower, which is required to defeat a threat that has had its life reduced to 0. So this threat has had its life reduced to 0 because it has 2 life. We played a 2 combat value card on it. So then I can play this card, and then all 3 of these would get sent to the discard pile. Now there are 3 types of different equipment cards. There are flares, which these let you ignore the effects of one threat for the rest of the round. And there are first aid kits, which help you to recover 1 health point. And then there are weapons, and the weapons are flamethrowers and ice axe, and those are what lets you defeat a threat that has its life taken to 0. Now some threats can only be defeated by ice axe, and some can only be defeated by the flamethrower. So you know, it's not always you can use one or the other, and there are going to be times when you can't play cards larger than 2. You know, the threat numbers or the combat value numbers come into play even more so than just doing the most damage that you can. All right, and then the 4th phase, you're going to endure the expedition, and that's where you draw the top card from the expedition deck. And if it's an event, first and foremost, you have to discard here. It says pay 1, this would be water. So you would look into your, hopefully, in your general supply, you have this card sitting there, which lets you play it as food. So if this is in your supply and this is the threat that comes up, or the event that comes up, you pay 1 water, so this would get discarded. And then you could do what this says, and this says light-footed, choose 1 threat, the effects of that threat are ignored for the rest of the round. So if there was a threat in play, see where this one says you cannot use cards with a combat value of 1 to attack this threat, you could actually ignore that for the rest of the round. And then these go into your discard pile, and you end up drawing them later as the game goes on. So that was an example of a good event. However, it is possible to draw a bad event, and in this case, you would pay this is food. So okay, so you're paying food that already is lousy, and then you're going to do something bad. Discard 1 flamethrower from the supply if possible, otherwise discard the top card of the Outpost deck. So these events typically are going to make a bad situation much, much worse. And then the 3rd type of card that you may draw from the expedition deck is an actual threat. Now these threats, as soon as you draw them, they will do 1 damage. Now what happens is you pick a player who has not yet been exhausted, and they take 1 damage. And what that means is during your round, let's say you're playing a game with 3 people, these 3 characters. Once a player takes their turn, you tap their card, and that player is exhausted for the rest of the round. So say that I'm Ice Climber Anai, or Anani. So say I'm the Ice Climber, and I drew this card, it would do 1 damage. I have to give 1 damage to a non-exhausted player in my group. So in this case, the person that would have to take the 1 damage is the trail guide. So this trail guide would then have her life go from 2 to 1. And then this threat is in play for the remainder of the game until we do 3 damage to it. And each one, again, has their own little action or threat that happens during a specific phase of the game. And then after your turn, you exhaust your character card and you go on to the next person's turn. At the end of the round, once all players have been exhausted, then all the threats take effect. So as the game goes on, you may have more than 1 threat. So in this case, let's just say you have these 3 threats in play. The stuff in each action box will take effect. So if you look here, this one, you cannot use cards with a CV1 to attack this threat. You don't have to worry about that guy doing anything to you. That's just kind of an ongoing lingering effect. Some of this, as you see here, this one, at the end of each round, while this threat is in play, you must discard 1 food from the supply if possible. Otherwise, 1 player loses 1 health point. So as you can see, the effect from this threat is going to be pretty detrimental and pretty bad if you don't clear it up quick. And then if you have all 3 of these out, this one would also make you discard 1 water, otherwise you lose a hit point. So it definitely is key to attack and get rid of like a lot of these with the ongoing effects more than the ones that just kind of linger and don't do anything that's really too brutal to you. And the game continues on until all the expedition cards are cleared from the deck. And at that point, you're rescued, you're at the top of the mountain, a helicopter comes down, yay, we all can have coffee, tea, and hot cocoa. However, if any one of your characters that you're playing with dies, you lose. Or if there are ever 5 threats in play at the end of any turn, you lose. It's just too much to handle and you guys are just completely overwhelmed. So that, in a nutshell, is how to play Outpost Siberia. Now I'm going to take you over and I'm going to do a brief run through and just to kind of give you an example of what some turns look like in this game.